Hey everyone, welcome to part 3 of our DevOps Masterclass. And this is really diving into some of the tooling that we'll actually use as part of that great big DevOps cycle. Now, in other parts of this masterclass, last week I went into detail about Git, for example. In future parts, we'll talk more about pipelines and packages and many other concepts. So in this part, I wanted to kind of introduce really GitHub and Azure DevOps, but there are many others as well. But really understanding where those products play in that overall cycle and maybe try and clarify, well, which of them do we use? What parts are they better at? But just really provide some overall context. As always, if this is useful, a like, subscribe, comment, and share really is appreciated. There's a huge amount of work that goes into this, and just hit that bell icon to get notified of any new updates. Just as a really quick refresher, remember, this is part of the overall masterclass, so I'm adding it to the playlist. So if you go to just NTFAQ guy on YouTube, I've got kind of key content, and you'll see we have the Azure DevOps Masterclass kind of in that list, or you could absolutely just go to the regular playlists and you would see the kind of DevOps Masterclass is right there. And also don't forget that we obviously have the GitHub repo. Now that GitHub repo I'm obviously going to be using today for some of these demonstrations, but in that repo you can see already we have part 1 and part 2. Part 2 obviously has, for example, all of the code we used for that project last week about actually diving in, really getting to know Git in detail. So these parts are all kind of building on the other parts. So let's dive into it. And what I think about, there are many parts to DevOps. This is not just, hey, this one tiny thing. There's this cycle of ongoing kind of feedback, these small iterations constantly delivering incremental value. And that's kind of the key point. Now, if I think about the cycle, where do we start? So in our cycle, what we have is the idea of, well, we plan. So we have a whole planning exercise to work out, well, what do we want to focus on? And then we develop. We obviously have to create code, whatever that might be, to make these ideas we have in the planning a reality. But we don't do that in isolation. So what we're also doing is obviously we have to be able to collaborate with other people on the team, maybe with the business stakeholders, and then we deliver. So when I think about, okay, so deliver, I may be generating some code. I have to actually go and place it into environments to test and validate. And then obviously we operate. Once it's actually running, we have to monitor that. We have to get feedback on what's being used, how the users are interacting. And the whole point of all of this, it's a continual cycle. We plan, we develop certain aspects of that plan, we work together to actually create that, make it a reality. Then we drive that into different environments to test it, QA, user acceptance, into production. We gather feedback on, well, what's being used, what isn't, what's working well, where are there problems, which goes into the next plan. So it's this continual evolution of what we're doing. And as part of that, it's the people, it's the process. But obviously there are tools as well that drive. And what I want to focus on today is GitHub and Azure DevOps. Now, I want to be very clear, there are others as well. There is not a right or wrong solution for these. It might be today, hey, I'm using Jira for my planning. I might be using Jenkins for my build. I might be using Bitbucket for my repos. I'm using Slack for my communications. Whatever works, fantastic. All I'm trying to show in this is how I leverage tooling to put into reality the different concepts we're going to talk about. Now, one of the interesting things about the whole GitHub and Azure DevOps is obviously Microsoft acquired GitHub. I think this was back in June 2018. And when I think about what does Azure DevOps do and what does GitHub do, there's a pretty big amount of overlap between them. So often there's a confusion about, well, which one should I be using? Why do I use that part? Can I move this bit? And really understand sort of why did Microsoft buy GitHub? If you think about GitHub, it really is the home of open source. I think about most applications today, about 90% of that is leveraging open source technology. And that lives in GitHub. So GitHub is really that home for open source, which therefore is the home for a huge amount of developers, huge amount of intellectual property out there. Whereas Azure DevOps really had its foundation in large enterprises, how large enterprises worked, how they managed projects, the functionality they needed. And so what we have now is we're kind of bringing those things together, and we'll see this kind of evolution about taking whatever bits make the most sense. Now, a key part of Azure DevOps was always use the bits that make the most sense. I don't have to use all of Azure DevOps. I can really use as little or as much as I want. Likewise, GitHub, I don't have to use all of its functionality. I can interact with other things. Now, one thing I will say, there is a very, very tight integration between these. They are very tightly coupled now. I can very easily integrate things like, hey, a Git repo in GitHub and pipelines in Azure DevOps. I can easily take commits, for example, and reference work items in an Azure DevOps board. So there's this great interaction between them. But to kind of demonstrate, if we jump over just for a second, if we look at Azure DevOps, for example, so I'm going to go over to Azure DevOps, and everything's kind of organized in a project. And I can create a new project. Now, within my organization, I just say kind of, hey, a new project. I give it a name, kind of test. Is it public or private? So you have that choice. Notice, this is an interesting one. So it's going to use Git for the version control by default, but it still has Team Foundation version control as an option. And this is kind of an interesting thing if we think about how long Microsoft will support things for. A really long time. We can pick, well, how are we doing work item? It really has this rich options of kind of agile, basic, CMMI, i.e. waterfall, Scrum. And then once I actually create a project, I'm just going to jump out of that for a second. If we actually go into a project, one I've created already, in the project settings, you can absolutely turn on or off different items of that functionality. So don't think, oh, okay, if I use Azure DevOps, I have to use all of it. Not at all. I can pick the components of it that really make the most sense for what I want to do. Now with GitHub, so I just showed you kind of the idea of a project here in Azure DevOps, which is really kind of that top level object under which things live, be it boards, which are kind of those work items, repos, I have pipelines, other types of things. Now in GitHub, it's really the repo where most things live. So it's not just my code or artifacts, my issues, my projects, my actions, which are kind of the workflow capabilities. Those all live under a repo. Now I can actually have projects, for example, outside of a specific repo. If I actually just went up for a second, a level, notice I can also here create a project and I can link a project to a repo. So one repo could be used by multiple different projects if I'm organizing those things. But for the most part in GitHub, most of what we do actually lives within a repository. Now I mentioned kind of that tight coupling, and I guess I'll touch on that really quickly. So if I go back to my Azure DevOps and I look at one of my projects, it's very common we're going to use GitHub for our Git repository. I'll talk about this, but it's basically a better solution. So if I go to my project settings, one of the things we actually have is under boards. Remember, boards is where we're going to track our work items, all that planning. We have this idea of GitHub connections. So with that GitHub connections, once I actually go and enable my GitHub connections, so actually this account doesn't have the permissions, but if I jump over to another account, you can see here my GitHub connections, I'm actually connected to my GitHub repo. I'm actually connected to multiple repos. Now when I do that, what that lets me do is actually within GitHub, when I perform, for example, a commit, well, I could actually now, if we go and have a look, for example, let's switch over for a second. And what I actually want to do in GitHub, if I look at one of the repos where I actually have that link, when I do commits, what I can actually do is, notice on this one, it has AB hash and then a work item. So that's Azure Boards #4. So it now links to that work item actually in Azure DevOps. It has that link. So now in Azure DevOps, if I was to actually go and look, and let's go and look at our boards. I'm going to talk about more about this in a second. Well, over here you can see that item 4 here. So that's item 4. And what it did automatically is you can see the little GitHub icon with a 1. So it added a link for this work item under development. It actually has a hyperlink I could click to go directly to that GitHub commit. So there's now a tight integration from the Azure board work item and actually commits and other things actually happening in GitHub. Likewise, I can almost sort of go the other way. So this same video planning team, if I go to my settings, one of the things we have is a status badge. Now I can allow anonymous access, but you can basically create this little status badge here. And this is basically just metadata of what's happening. And it has this sample markdown. Well, I can copy that and I can actually put that into, for example, the README file of a repo. So if I go and look at my regular random stuff repository, if we look at the README file, it actually shows me my Azure board status for the videos I'm working on. So I can actually have things linked between them very, very easily. And everything I'm going to kind of talk about today, for the most part, is free. When I talk about public repos, even some of the more advanced, for example, GitHub capabilities, I don't have to pay for those. Then when I do things like private repos, depending on what part, I may have to pay. For Azure DevOps, even private, I get a certain amount of users for free, and then I start paying for the additional users. But if you just want to kind of go and play around and learn these things, hey, generally, it's not going to cost you any money, especially if it's a public board, a public repo. I can just go and use this stuff. So that was just kind of showing some of those very easy interactions I can do in those things. But let's go back to this for a second. So let's think about what are we actually doing here. So if I'm planning, when we plan, we think of kind of these 3 levels. I want to track the work that we want to get done. We have a product owner who's really going to be responsible for creating the project in whatever tooling we're using, and then really maintain, keep the health of that. So when I think about planning, there's actually these levels. So we can think about, well, we have an epic. Now when I think about an epic, this is an organizational level strategy. Now I might have multiple epics, but they should all kind of in harmony relate to each other. This is some significant initiative that's going to impact maybe multiple products we have, maybe long-term strategy of what we're doing with a product. It's going to have a business case. It probably requires financial approval. And these business epics, they're going to drive value. So there's actually two types of epics I might have. A business epic, this is value to what we're doing. I might also have something called an enabler epic. And this is really required to enable me to move forward as a company. It might be an enhancement to enable that future delivery of future business requirements. But it's still important. If I don't have those enablers, well, I can't build on top of that to deliver value. So I think about these epics, which are these big organizational level strategies. Then once I've got this huge big picture initiative, well, that's probably going to break down into kind of multiple features. Now, a feature is part of my product roadmap. So that's how I can really think about that. I have my product roadmap. Now, these are going to go into a release of software. It meets a certain need for the value that I want to deliver. And I can deliver it in a single release. If I can't deliver it in a single release, then that's more of kind of an epic. I need to break it down into a feature I can deliver in a single release of whatever my product is. It has benefits. It has acceptance criteria. And again, single release, I'm thinking months in terms of a scale of time. Now those features, they're going to break down into user stories. Now the user story is what the actual delivery teams use. Now anyone can actually write these. This is not code language. These are focused around easy to read, and it's focused on what is the value? What is the role this impacts? Why are we doing it? What is the motivation behind this? What is the value this is going to drive? Now the product owner is going to review, edit, prioritize, whatever that is. But it's very much focused on the end user, the product, and the benefit, the value we're going to get. If I can't identify the value of the user story, chances are we're doing something wrong. It is the smallest unit of value that we have. And I want to be able to deliver this in a single cycle. Now, if I'm doing kind of Scrum, that's a single sprint. If it's more the Kanban, then it goes through and I complete that within a single movement through all of those different stages. This helps in our planning. I can estimate what I'm doing with these user stories. So I think about, hey, my user title, well, it's going to have a title, a description, and some kind of acceptance criteria. How do I know I've actually met the requirements around these? So when I think tooling, okay, we have these different levels of things that we want to do. I'm going to move this over a little bit. So we have the things we want to do. There is some pretty big difference here between Azure DevOps and GitHub. Remember, Azure DevOps had that whole enterprise history. That's where it came from. It came from, hey, enterprises have these requirements, want these functionalities. That's what drove the creation of Azure boards in Azure DevOps. So when I think Azure DevOps, so this is absolutely Azure boards. This is all around its planning. So we have the idea of work items, and then we actually have the idea of boards. And that enables us to really track and construct all of these different things. And it has this full support of these different types and actually more. It natively has the idea of epics and features and user stories. It has a native construct of relationships between them. Hey, so these user stories are part of this feature. This feature is part of this epic. I may even break these down even further. Well, there's actually kind of tasks that make up. I kind of check off as I go through it. It has native support for that as well. So all of these things I have. and it can then actually then easily view those on things like a Kanban board. I have tagging capabilities. I have all these features that make this very, very simple. So let's just actually look at this. So if we jump over, so right now we are switching over to Azure DevOps. So this is my video planning, and let's just go to work items first of all. So we can see from a new work item, notice what it has. Hey, it has the native idea of epics and features. It has user stories. It has tasks. It has bugs. It just has all of these things just built in. I don't have to do anything else. And notice what I've got here. So I actually created a DevOps Masterclass feature. And what I've then done under that feature, as we can kind of see over here in the bottom right hand corner, is it has these child items which are user stories. Hey, Masterclass 1, Masterclass 2, Masterclass 3, etc. So it has that full concept here of understanding these. Now, from any of these kind of work items, notice I've got these like 3 dots. Well, I can add other things, a new linked work item. I can change the type. I can move things around. If I actually go into one of the work items directly, notice, say, there's templates available, new linked work items. So there's things I can do directly from here. I can add links to existing or new items. So a new item, hey, what am I adding? Hey, I'm adding a task. It's all native within here. It has that very strong understanding of what I'm actually trying to do. Additionally, once I have all of these different capabilities in here, well, I can put all of these onto a board, and there's much more I can do. You'll notice kind of we've got this DevOps Masterclass. I can absolutely go and add tags. So up here, I can just add, and I can kind of add tags to this thing if I want to. But then we put them on boards. So if I jump over to my board, and I can have multiple boards, here we can see all of my work items. Now, this is showing me my stories. But if you notice, remember we might have different Kanban boards for our epics, our features, our user stories. I can actually go up here at the top, and on this drop down, I can change it to actually show me the features. What's my Kanban board for my features? So I can easily jump between those. When I think about actually wanting to manage my work, well, notice I've got kind of these swim lanes. I've got a high priority swim lane at the top, and I've kind of just got my regular. I can customize all of the columns. You'll notice that I have work in progress limits. I've got 1 of 3. I'm at 1 of 2. I can manage all of this. So if I go to my settings, notice I have the options for my columns. I can add columns. I can select my work in progress limits. I can say, do I want to split it into doing and done? I can map the state to various things in the user story. I can have definitions of when this is complete. I can define swim lanes. So yes, hey, things are flowing through my Kanban board, but maybe I put something on it that's a higher priority. Okay, I want to see that. I want to be able to easily see those various things that I actually have in there. There's all other things. I can set working days. I can have things like my status badges. I can customize huge amounts of insight and flexibility. You can see here the fields. Hey, I could add additional fields I want to my user story. I can customize the styles, tag colors, annotations. If I have other kind of work items, I can easily just kind of, they'd be in my backlog. I can just drag and drop them into wherever I want. We can see our backlog. I can go over here and see all my backlog items. I can create sprints. So I could have different sprints depending on the pieces of work I have. but it gives me a very rich capability to manage my work. It really does fit into those kind of agile methodologies. And of course, I can have various options. I can filter. So I could filter it down and say, okay, maybe I only want to see things assigned to me. I only want to see things with certain tags, certain iterations, certain areas, types. I have full control. I have analytics to actually see, hey, what's going through the average work in progress. I can get a full report. These are important when I actually come back and want to see the impact and how we're actually working as a team. So we really think, okay, this is where, I mean, honestly, Azure DevOps just shines. Azure DevOps really is the superior solution today when I think about that aspect of planning. It just has richer capabilities. And it's not to say GitHub doesn't have anything here. So when I think about GitHub, now GitHub, really all these things live in the repo. Remember in Azure DevOps we had a project, and under the project we have these different types of functionality. I can turn boards on or off. So this really was that kind of, hey, I create a project, these live under the project. In GitHub, these really are part of the repo. And we have this one type of thing. We have an issue. It doesn't really have a concept of an epic, a feature, a user story, a task. It doesn't have it. What we can do though, is we can use labels. And we're going to kind of see that. And I can create links between different issues we have. Then it has the idea of projects. So projects let me take the issues and kind of organize them in a board format. And then it also does have kind of a discussion capability. And the discussion capability could be nice when I'm planning. I want somewhere I can go and maybe just interact with the various people in my environment. So if we go and look at this part of it. So let's jump over and now go to GitHub. Now once again, the key part here is, notice I'm in a repo. I'm going to DevOps Masterclass. This lives under the repo. So under the repo, yes, we have code, but we also have issues. We have pull requests, we have actions, we have projects, we have a wiki. So all of these things live under the repo. Now if I go to the issues, notice, hey, we use the issue for all of the types, because an issue now can be a task, a scenario, a bug, anything we want. And we're going to use labels. Now labels really are common across GitHub. I can use it for pretty much anything. Just again, another name for a tag. But I cannot do a hierarchy. I can't have a strict hierarchy of epics to features to user story. I cannot do things like manage sprints in a really consistent way. If I wanted to create an epic, well, I would create an issue. Now notice I've got a template. I'll show you more about this in a second. I could just say open a blank issue. And then what I would do is on my label, I would add it to be called epic. If it doesn't exist, then I could go and create a new, I could edit my label and create a new label called epic. So I would use it that way. So I would create a label called epic. And what I would then do is actually create a milestone. So for that milestone, I would create a milestone, which is a certain point in time. I can have this due date, I can have a description, and I would link the epic. So I'd mark it as epic label, give it a milestone. I could even create a template for epic, so it automatically adds, for example, that label to it. And I would describe those various things. For my features, I've got a test feature here. Well, guess what? My feature has a label of feature. Notice I've already added it to a milestone over here on the right, release 1. And again, I've got that label feature. So although I only have one type, I can use the labels to kind of break those things up. And I can have, so notice here I've got kind of test issue, issue 1, and notice I've got a link to a user story. So I've actually added that in as part of it. So I could go and actually open up. So there's the open there. I selected that. And this is part of feature 2. So I have that ability. Now, one of the things I mentioned is, hey, we want to break it down even further. What about if we have tasks? Remember, in Azure DevOps, when I was on my board, notice I've got this 0 of 2 right here, because it natively understands the idea that tasks belong to user stories. And I can just see that, and hey, I could check a box when I've completed a certain task. I could add new tasks. From here, I can easily add tasks. I can add bugs. So it's very easily integrated with Azure DevOps. It's just there because it has that hierarchy. We don't have that hierarchy in GitHub. However, what we do have is, this is markup language. And it's not just dumb markup language. So what I can do is, if I do edit, notice what it's got here. If I just, actually let's just do a new one. It'll actually be easier. Let's go to my issues. And I'm just going to create a new issue. We're not going to use a template. So I'm going to say, okay, new issue. Now remember, I can reference other things. I can just do kind of hash. And notice it shows me, oh yeah, I want to link to test issue, that feature. So I can just do hash and it links that. I need to do things. I can have a list. I just do dash space item 1. If I do enter, it automatically puts the dash in. But now I actually need a task list. So I do dash square bracket space square bracket task 1. And I just push enter and it automatically did that again. Task 2, task 3, stuff, etc. In the preview, it's actually made them checkboxes. So I hit submit. Now, I didn't add a label. I should have done that. So I would want to add a label to actually make this, in this case, a user story. I might assign it other things, a project, whatever. But I've now created that. If I now go back out of this for a second, it understands there's tasks. So look what we have. That test issue 1 I already have. It's showing me 1 of 3 tasks because I checked one of the boxes. The one I just created, it just says there's 3 tasks, but I've not done any of them yet. But if I was to actually, remember, go into it again, I can just check a box. Now it knows 1 of 3 tasks is done. So even though it doesn't have a type called task really, the markup language is actually really powerful. I can get tasks that way. Remember, I can assign it. Hey, I really probably should assign this to myself, or I could assign it to someone else. So that's me kind of creating the issues which relate to all the different types of things we actually can have. So it's richer than it initially seems. That markup language actually gives me some cool capabilities. If I go to projects, again, I can create multiple projects. When I create a new project, I give it a name, a description. It has a template. So I could start off completely empty and I would add the columns. It has a basic Kanban. It has an automated Kanban that as I move issues, as pull requests happen, it will move things along the column. I can add in an automated Kanban with reviews, there's bug triage. So there are things to help me get started. Now what I have is my kind of masterclass planning. I've not added any extra columns, but you can see I could add more columns if I wanted to. I could just click add column and I'm away. I can edit the existing columns to a new name. And then what I can do is I can add my items to these. So from here, if I was to, for example, add, I can add just a basic note. So So this isn't an issue, it's just a textual, very lightweight note that I can leverage from here. Or if I do add cards on the right, it's showing me the other issues I have that I've not currently added to the board. So I can now take this and drag it over. And once again, it's showing me the status, hey, 1 of 3 tasks we have in here. So it has those capabilities that, hey, it doesn't have all the features of Azure Boards. I don't have work in progress limits. I can't do that. But I do still have a fairly rich, and they have a kind of beta going on right now that's adding more functionality to it. But when I think about these projects, when I link in the ability with the issues to have the concept of, hey, I can add my own labels if the ones that are built in don't match. I can add milestones. Well, that really does give me some pretty nice capabilities. Now remember I said when I was actually working on my issues and I added a new issue, notice I had this user story template. So I can add my own templates. If I go to the settings of my repo, what we actually have under features, notice I have issues, I can set up templates. Now when I set up these templates, exactly as it suggests, I can add a new template. Is it a feature request? Is it a custom? And it's going to give me help in what that should look like. And again, I can modify all of these different things. I could start with a blank one. I can customize all of the different aspects of this. I could add a default label to it, for example. Hey, I want to add user story, or I want to add feature, whatever I want to make this part of it. And so then once I have that, now that's available when I go and create a new issue. So I can create templates for my issues. So now when I go and create a new issue, rather than having to fill everything in, I don't think I actually hit save on that, I can use those actual templates that I create. And notice it even has the option to edit templates directly in here, which again are just files in my repo. Everything we kind of do in GitHub, that's why it's part of the repo. Underneath everything else, they are files within my repository. And again, what I should have done when I did the templates, just going to be a little bit too quick. When you add the template, so you can do that feature request, I have to hit propose changes up there at the top, because that will actually then commit it. So I'm actually doing a commit to my repo. So I have to propose the change. Notice it's going to do a commit, doing it directly to main. Now that would show up as one of my templates. I can even take, for example, remember we're going to create repos around this. When I create a new repo, I can actually make a new repo from an existing one. I could take my DevOps Masterclass repo, and if I check this box to make it a template repository, when I create a new repo, someone could just look at this and say, basically create a new repo. All of the structure, the content I have in this repo will now just be part of the new one. So if I had a set of things I wanted in every new repo I set up for like all my different maybe projects in my company, I can create that template repository and then start from that state for every other. I'm not doing a fork. This is actually just going to take this all and copy it as a complete distinct separate one. Now, while I'm in here looking at my settings, I also have this option to turn on discussions. So this is down here. So this is just a place I can really do anything I want. So if I turn this on, now this is a public repo. I was going to leave this turned on so we could interact. Unfortunately, as soon as I turned it on, within 5 minutes, someone tried to post, hey, you should give me work. So I've disabled it, and I'm going to disable it again. But if you turn on discussions, what we're now going to see pop up is up here, we now have discussions. Now, if I go to discussions now, this is just a general thing where we can talk as the people working on this project. I can announce things. I could have a general, so I created kind of a general welcome. We could have ideas, Q&A, show and tell. This is a great way that I can go and interact with the different people working on this project. And that's really kind of a key point behind this. I'm going to turn it back off so I don't get a bunch of random stuff again. And now it's gone. That's really a great way that we can think about brainstorming. I can really have anything going on. Now there's a wiki. Wiki is a great way to kind of have standard information, maybe setting the strategy for what we're doing, how we perform certain tasks. We have those capabilities that we can leverage. And of course, there may just be general communication. Maybe I'm using Teams or Slack or something else for more live meeting type things as well. So that was really how I think about the planning. So there's a lot of features there. There's so much, I think, going into a huge amount of detail. But if I'm starting off scratch, I'm going to say this kind of for all of these things, start with GitHub. If I can do what I need in GitHub, fantastic. There might be times actually, hey, I need stuff Azure DevOps can do. Again, they can interact very tightly. But if I can, I'd probably try and do it with GitHub if I was starting scratch today. But this does today have richer capabilities. It just is where it is. So that's my planning. I have all these great capabilities around the planning. The next thing is the development. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I think this is actually about the tools that I'm using to actually develop my project. Now, this could be developer tools. So I may have things like Visual Studio. I might use things like VS Code. Now remember, VS Code is free. And there's really a huge amount of cool things we can do with VS Code. Now, I might have my machine. My machine is great. It does everything I need. Maybe it's not. Maybe I'm at someone else's machine. Maybe my machine is just not that powerful. So one of the interesting things right now is GitHub have this idea of code spaces. Now, today, this is only if you're part of a GitHub kind of organization. These are on-demand hosted environments for VS Code. A whole bunch of languages supported, a whole bunch of plugins available, different powers for what I need that I can use to develop on. And I can show you this quickly, just how this kind of looks. So if I go to my GitHub again, now a key point from here is this is my personal. I'm kind of John the Brit. I do not have the option to use spaces. If I go to my code, all I can do is clone. But if I switch out to my Saviltech organization, and I'll just pick my sample repo. If I select code now, I have a code spaces option. This will spin up essentially a Linux container on a VM in Azure that has a default set of capabilities, plugins, but I can customize that as well. So very easy to spin up. And notice if I do I could create a new code space. So it picks the size, 2 core, 4 core. Now obviously I pay for these things. So the bigger you create, hey, it's costing my company more money. But then it would basically give me the option of either being available via the browser, as kind of a VS Code in the browser, or I could actually integrate from the VS Code client on my machine. And if you click the kind of learn more, the overview, it talks all about what this is. So you can see, hey, yeah, it's this VM-based compute. Again, I can use VS Code Desktop or VS Code Browser, many different browsers. It's going to automatically have a clone of my repository just available to me. Whole bunch of languages supporting, tooling, and it goes into detail about how you're using these. Now, again, you're going to pay for this. It's spinning up essentially a VM in Azure, so this is not a free thing. Your company will pay for this. But it now gives me that ability to have that environment essentially anywhere. So that's a very nice capability that's now been added via GitHub. When I think about VS Code, there's also a bunch of other extensions. So one of the really nice ones is something called LiveShare. Now, we're going to talk about collaborating. I kind of debated where to put that. LiveShare lets essentially me have multiple people using VS Code sharing like a co-authoring. If you've ever used Word or PowerPoint, You can co-author. You kind of see each other moving around. You can discuss things. It does the same thing for your coding. So it's just an extension in VS Code. So if I jump to VS Code, and let's close that for a second. If I go to my extensions, I can just search for live, and it's right there, live share. So I install this, and then what I can actually do is basically collaborate on the same screen. You'll see each other what you're doing. You can interact and work on the code together. So it's a really nice kind of shared environment that you're working on the same piece of code. Now, while I'm in here looking at extensions, there's also something looking for, there you go, CodePilot. Now, you have to actually sign up for this. It's a preview. You have to sign up. You install it, and then you authenticate to GitHub. Think about most of the time when you're writing code, are you writing groundbreaking functionality? Maybe you are. Most of the time you're not. Most of the time someone's probably done it already, what you're trying to achieve. If you think what GitHub has, these repos, that millions and millions of pieces of code. So what CodePilot does is it's essentially using AI and kind of all of the repos, and it kind of looks at what are you doing and goes and finds me code that probably does what I'm trying to do. So if I put in a comment like, workout date of tomorrow, it will go and say, hey, this code probably does what you want to do based on the language you're currently editing. So we'll go and fill that in. I can hit kind of control return. It will give me a list of pieces of code that I can select from that maybe does what I'm trying to do. So it's just the idea that helping me, rather than me going and searching the web to find a bit of code that does what I'm trying to do, as I'm using it in VS Code, it will actually suggest, it's probably what you're trying to do. Here you go. So it's going to speed things up massively. And again, we do it today ourselves. Hey, I'm doing this PowerShell, and I go and search for something. As I'm doing things and typing those kind of comments, it's going to do that for me. So these are some nice things that actually help that development phase. But that development phase is all about just me tooling that I'm using. And again, there's a ton of different tools. I'm not saying one's any better than the other. VS Code is really nice because it's got all these extensions. So many things are kind of integrating in with it. But generally, I'm not a team of one. I have to collaborate with the other people on my team. So this is where when we get to kind of this collaboration, this is all about really, it builds from the repository. So everything I'm kind of doing here, I think about that repo idea. So we have, hey, fundamentally it's going to boil down to my repo. Now obviously both Azure DevOps and GitHub have capabilities around the repos. So I used Orange for Azure DevOps. So obviously we have Azure DevOps repos. Now, Azure DevOps repos fully supports Git. If we jump over and actually take a look at this. So let's jump over from here back to our Azure DevOps. So we're on our board. But obviously we have repos down here. Now, it has all of the functionality you would expect. I don't have any code in this one. So if we jump out actually, let's just say, look at a different repo. We have all of the familiar Git concepts. Obviously I can have files. I can have things like pull requests, branching. I have all of those common capabilities. Now actually, if I look at the configuration of that one, jump back again. Notice I have commits, pushes, branches, tags. All of that key functionality we would totally expect. We have that here. It's fully Git compatible. Obviously I want to be using Git and not the old kind of Team Foundation version control format. But it has all of the things we would totally expect. But really it's GitHub where this stuff shines. So this is obviously where GitHub was the major kind of how it started off, and it has just a far superior solution. So if we actually think about GitHub repos, yes, they're both Git. But remember, under the GitHub repo, it's really all the types of object. Remember we saw those issues lived under there. Our GitHub actions, our workflows are going to live under there. But really the big deal here is we have this advanced security. Now there's many other things as well. But this is really a huge one. We have this whole focus on shifting left. I don't want to do security once it's in prod, and I look for problems. I want to, when I push code, check for things there. Do I have secrets in my code? Am I using maybe dependencies that have security vulnerabilities? Have I written some bad code? I want to be checking as early as I can, early and often, which is kind of a key theme to everything we do. So the GitHub repos is just a much richer solution. Another big thing about GitHub, again, if we think about where it kind of shines and some of those things that where it's come from, this is very good about inner source. So we talk about open source, the idea that, hey, we have this code and project that's available to everyone. Inner source is, hey, I as a company, I have different projects, but I want to be able to leverage maybe investments other teams have done. Maybe they want to contribute to my work or use the work I've done. So GitHub is really, really strong on kind of this inner source idea, making it super easy to collaborate and find things that other people in my company have done. Now for both of these, remember the construct is, hey, I have kind of that main branch. When I'm going to run a project, I don't work on the main branch. What we're going to do, remember, is, hey, for my project that I'm creating, I'll go and spin off my own branch, and this is where I do my kind of work until I'm ready, and that's when I would bring it back in. I would kind of do that idea of a pull request from my team when I'm ready to pull that into the main branch. So we want that continual kind of functionality to enable that. I may have other branches going on as well. So the key first point is obviously we have to support branches. All of these support branches. And let's just actually jump over and take a look. So if we go and look at our code. So I'm going to actually go and look at GitHub again. So remember the repo, I'll just jump back over to my personal. In this, we have our code. So remember, we would go and create a branch. And that branch would be where we would go and do our work. Now, if I was starting from scratch, and hey, I'm coming in and I'm just starting my brand new, completely top level project, I need a new repository as well. Well, I can go ahead and create a new repository. So if I was to go ahead and create a new, from here, I just give it a name. So let's just say test1. And notice I have an option of public or private. I can initialize it with some default files. Now this public and private is because this is just me as kind of John the Brit. This is not part of any kind of organization or anything else. If I was to switch over to the company and create a new repository, for example, notice I have this middle option of internal. So here it can actually be used by people within my company. So that would really help push the idea of having that inner source. The idea that, hey, now it's something that's not publicly available, but it's available within my actual company to share and collaborate and do those various pieces of interactions with. I already showed you the idea of, hey, if I have a repo, I can do things like actually making it available as a template so it can just be copied. Remember, under settings, I can make it a template repository. The visibility can be changed. So if I created it as one and I want to change it in the future, I can absolutely, so notice there's, just to confirm, go in if I want to change the access, type my password in, but I can modify things around my repository. Notice also, I can turn on, as we talked about, the different features. So just like Azure DevOps, it doesn't have to be everything. I can turn on or off different elements I want within here. So I could turn off wikis, for example. I could restrict editing to collaborators only on those wikis. So I do have controls. Now obviously danger zone, I can delete the repository, transfer ownership, change the visibility. So here I can actually go and change it to, for example, become a private. So I have those things I can do. Now I mentioned the idea that, hey, I create a branch because I want to do work on a branch. I don't want to do work on main. And this is when I go and create a new repository, what I really want to do is I can go and look at my branches. And what I probably want to do is have a branch protection rule. So what a branch protection rule lets me do is, hey, I can say, hey, for main, for example, I require a pull request. I don't want people merging directly into it, for example. I could require signed commits. I have all these different things I might allow on that. But I can essentially protect branches so people have to follow the process we actually want them to do. So that's super important. When I go and set up my new repository, my main branch, I want to kind of protect. So I'm probably going to put kind of a branch protection rule on that. And that then controls, hey, you have to go and develop in your own branch and then submit a pull request to actually bring it into the main branch where we'll then interact with everyone else's kind of work on that. So obviously GitHub is doing Git, but it's some of those security features that make it so powerful. So if we go and look at what else we can do. So what I'm looking under the sort of options here, we have this security and analysis. Now for a public repo, I can use all these things. Notice I have Dependabot alerts. This is going to tell me about, hey, you're using some dependency, maybe some NPM or Maven, whatever it is package, it has a vulnerability. It can create pull requests to fix it for me automatically as well. I can easily upgrade non-vulnerable dependencies. I can have code scanning. So code scanning is part of CodeQL. It actually converts your code really to data so that it can be scanned and it can find, again, security vulnerabilities. It can, again, trigger various things. It's going to find insecure code. There's also the idea of secret scanning. So what it can actually do is go and find, hey, you've accidentally put a secret in here. And it will notify you of that. It works with, I think it's saying like 35 different providers, and it knows what their secrets look like. So if it finds it, it can notify you and talk to the provider to invalidate it. Hey, you've got this shared access secret key out there. You probably didn't mean that. We're going to go and flag that. If I jump over to a different repo, I think it's under this one. Notice we found potential security vulnerabilities. Under security tab up here, I can actually go and see, hey, Dependabot alerts. I've got a critical severity here. I've got a low severity. But I can dive into these and it gives me, hey, this is the remediation. This is what you should do to actually go and resolve this problem. I could also see kind of code scanning alerts. Again, it's using that CodeQL. I've got no alerts here, so that's a good thing from that perspective. There's security advisories. But I have these additional features that I can actually go in. I can set up a security policy. So if I just want to start setup here, hey, I would go through and tell people about what I'm supporting, security upgrades. I have those capabilities. Again, files in my repo. So from this point, we have all these security features that really are shifting that security left, and they're all benefits. And if it was a private repo, yes, there's licensing. For the Dependabot, I think that's the enterprise license. For things like the code QL, I think the secret scanning, I think there's an additional advanced security to get that. But if it's a public repo, I just have those things. Notice I've just turned them on this. It's not costing me anything. It's the public repo. So I can just go and get all of that goodness without really having to do anything. So generally, my guidance would be, hey, look, for my Git repos, GitHub is a better solution. With kind of, again, that it's going to find the secrets I have. It's going to help me identify vulnerabilities, dependencies. It can use that code QL, especially, again, if it's public, it's not even costing me anything. And we saw a kind of a bunch of that last week. I did the pull request demo last week in the master Git, so definitely go and look at that if you're curious about how those things work. And then we think about, well, I have to actually deliver these things. I have to deliver the feature. And this is where we really get into the idea of kind of the pipelines, the continuous integration and the continuous delivery, and maybe continuous deployment. Remember, continuous deployment takes continuous delivery one step further and actually deploy it out into my production environment. So when we think about this, we had that repo. So the repo is, remember, where we're putting our code into. So I can think on kind of this far end of the channel, I have the idea of my repo. And remember, we can do different types of actions to our repo. I can do a commit. That could just be to my branch. And remember, we constantly want to do that continuous integration as we do the commits, or maybe it's scheduled. I want to make sure we're not breaking things in our branch. So there's some event. And I want to trigger a pipeline. So I think about having this pipeline, this continuous integration. And again, ideally, I kind of want security at the start there. I want to be doing some sort of checks on things. So maybe there's kind of some security checks. It would have to actually go and check out the code, but then I would build, I would test. So basic, maybe smoke test type things. Maybe I create some image, and then I kind of push that up to maybe some kind of registry. So some package management type solution. So that's continuous integration. So we end up with some artifact that we push to some kind of registry. But then I can think about, okay, maybe then what we actually have is a pull request merge. So maybe they've done a pull request and now it's actually merged into main. Well, at this point, I could take that artifact. There's a challenge with that. Maybe this was done maybe even at the end of a pull request. This could be a commit. It could be a pull request. Again, they do some builds to create something to check it, make sure it's healthy. But would I want to take this and deploy it to my environments? Because this was built off of the branch, not main. This is now merged into main. So probably I'd still have kind of an integration. I'd probably still at this point rebuild it because now it's building off of main. So again, I'd probably firstly build the environment, maybe my test environment, infrastructure as code, stateful. Then I would actually kind of build the solution again off of main and kind of deploy it into something. Then we'd have some tests. Again, kind of smoke tests, other things. Now maybe I deploy into, so that was deploy maybe test. Now maybe I deploy to QA. Maybe I deploy to prod. That depends though. So this is kind of continuous delivery And then that would be a continuous deployment. I would not just do this as a straight line. I would definitely have gates. Now the gates will vary. The gates might be time. They might be reviews, so a manual kind of approval. It might be checking for a certain number of bugs. There's different things I can do here. So this is where Azure DevOps is very rich. Now, there's two parts actually to that. So when I think about from the Azure DevOps perspective, we have pipelines. So if I think about my colors, so we'll do orange again. So this is Azure DevOps pipelines. And we have the concept of releases. Pipelines is kind of a lot of CI. Releases is more continuous delivery, continuous deployment. So let's have a look at this. So if we jump over, and let's go and look at our Azure DevOps. And what I'm actually going to do at this point, I'm going to switch over to a different organization just to show some pipelines. So I've got this kind of deployment pattern demo. So we have this idea of pipelines. So we have pipelines, and these are really just a set of actions. So if I go to edit, we can just see, well, we have an agent job, and it just does a bunch of things. This is essentially just building some code. You can see it does install some requirements, does a test, and then publishes it out actually as an artifact. So that's the CI part, and it's this kind of visual element I can leverage. Then we have the idea of releases. So for a release, let's just edit this, we have steps. Now we have an initial trigger. So this is a continuous deployment trigger. And so we can see here, this is enabled. And every time a new build is available, this is actually going to go and trigger. And then we just basically have stages. Now for each stage, I can define pre-deployment conditions. So notice I can have pre-deployment approvals. I can have gates. I can also have gates post-deployment. So before it moves on. So for all of these things, so before, let's say, ring 1 starts, I have gates, and I have, for example, hey, a delay of 5 minutes configured here. But I could add other gates. Notice here there's a whole set of things I could do. I could check for policy compliance. I could invoke an Azure function, a REST API, query work items. Have their bugs been submitted? How's my Azure Monitor looking? ServiceNow change management. Notice I can do pre-deployment approvals. I can add people that have to approve before this moves on to the next level. And I'm going to spend a lot of time on this. We're going to cover this in a lot more detail next week. But that's kind of a key point, that in Azure DevOps, I have this idea of, well, we have these pipelines that we leverage to build the code and then actually push the code through. Now for these, when I think about these builds, and this is actually going to be a common thing, I can build across Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. And I can do that build either using kind of cloud, i.e. Azure hosted agents, or self-hosted agents. That's for Azure DevOps. So for Azure DevOps, we use the term agents. So either Microsoft hosted, they're just part of it, it could be those 3 things, or they can be self-hosted, I run them. Same operating systems. They establish an outbound HTTPS and they go and pull down jobs that I request. Maybe there's things on premises I want to actually use as part of the build. Now for GitHub, they have GitHub Actions. Just checking I'm using the consistent coloring. So we have GitHub. Now they use the term runners. So for GitHub, we have runners. But it's the same, Windows, Linux, Mac OS, they have GitHub hosted, or again, I can have self-hosted runners. So I can still do those same things. And in the GitHub world, this is GitHub Actions. Now, if we think about the history, essentially, I think when Microsoft acquired GitHub, a lot of the team kind of moved over. I think they took a fork of the Azure pipelines, the Azure DevOps pipelines, and it became GitHub Actions. But I think there was a lot of conversions went on with lots of different things. I think they worked in different ways. So that they're not like just compatible. I can't just take anything from like Azure DevOps and stick it in GitHub Actions. GitHub Actions is all YAML. So whereas with the Azure DevOps, I can do that GUI or I can do a YAML based, GitHub Actions is all YAML. But the difference here is GitHub Actions is for any event. So Azure DevOps is built around CI/CD. That's what it's there for. GitHub Actions is any event. And that's actually really powerful. So it's not just CI/CD. So I could think about, hey, someone creates a new issue. I can trigger a workflow using GitHub Actions. Someone contributes to a discussion. Hey, I can trigger something to happen. It's not just about someone does a commit or a pull request. So I can do so many more things with GitHub Actions. And the idea of the YAML is it's code. It's just stored in my repo like anything else. So that's why it's kind of an attractive thing. So if we go and look at this, now, it's not going to have this kind of prettiness to this flow. But what I can actually do is if we just go and look, I can go to my actions. And notice I've got a CI workflow already, but I can just say a new workflow, and it's going to give me a bunch of templates I can leverage. Deploy my code, so CI. It has a whole set of ones I can start with. Deploy Node.js to Azure Web App or Alibaba or Amazon ECS. There's continuous integration workflows. Again, there's a whole bunch of these that I can leverage. But it also has things, well, other stuff. Hey, I want to set up a greeting for someone contributes to the repo. Labels pull requests. Some manual workflow. And again, these are all just YAML files. And although it's not that graphical drag and drop, I've already copied this sample workflow. So if we go to the actions and I look at that workflow, and so this is my basic hello over here. So if we look at this one, and I just want to view the file. So here's the file. I'm going to edit it. Look at what we're doing. It has a name. But then what we have, the big deal is on. These are the triggers. So in this case, this triggers anytime there is a push or pull request to the main branches. And again, we're going to cover this in more detail in the next part of this. I'm not going to go in a bunch of detail right now. Then it's really just a series of jobs. And these ones are basically doing nothing. Hey, what's the runner I'm using, Ubuntu? It checks out the content of my repo, and then it just does a run. Hey, hello world. Not super interesting. But on the right-hand side, you have this marketplace. I can go and search for things I'm trying to do. So maybe it's an Azure, I don't know, web app. Oh, look, Azure Web App. Deploy to Azure Web App. Oh, here's a bunch of code. So I could just take this, copy it to my clipboard, and then go and put it into my YAML file. So it makes it actually fairly easy to do those things. Now, obviously, one of the things you're not seeing here is what about those gates? I don't have that kind of gate, those pre and post steps that we had as part of the Azure DevOps. So what this has is in my settings for the repo, I can define environments. So I can create, so there was test, maybe I create one called prod. Now what I can do in the environments, I'm going to target these environments as part of those deployments. And notice I can configure reviewers. So before I can actually push to this environment, hey, someone has to review this. So I could actually put in my reviewers. I could add in a wait timer. Hey, you have to wait 15 minutes before this will push. Let's turn that off for a second. I could limit who can push to this. So if this was production, maybe I change this to only protected branches. Remember my main branch I protected. Or I could have selected branches. And here I could actually go and add main. So now only from the main branch I can push to this environment. I can actually have environment level secret, so I could have the same secret defined in different environments, so it has different values based on the environment I'm pushing it to. So this is how I could think about doing the gates. I can't do it as part of kind of the workflow, but I actually don't need to. In the environment itself, which in a lot of ways makes a lot of sense, rather than doing it at every single workflow, the environment says, hey, to push to me, I can only accept from this branch. I require these people to approve. I have this wait from the previous step. So we can define environments to really control those kind of gates. So we do have that ability. It's just done in a very different way than how Azure DevOps does it. And obviously there's package management. So GitHub has its package management, which has release concepts. Azure DevOps has artifacts. So when we talk about this thing over here, this is kind of Azure DevOps artifacts and kind of GitHub kind of packages. So we have those, I guess it should be package management. When I think about those kind of actual registers where I'm building something, I want to store it and then use it maybe as part of my CD, depending on exactly how they're flowing together. Today, again, DevOps, as you kind of saw, was richer, especially on this continuous deployment side. But I do think GitHub has come a long way with the actions. Those environments maybe meet your needs. So it definitely, you can go and look and see, well, what can I actually do with those? And then finally, obviously, we have to operate. Now, when I think about operating, there's many different aspects to that kind of operate phase. Now, I can think about, obviously, there's always monitoring. Now, when we talk about monitoring, we talk about monitoring, yes, the kind of environment. We need to know, hey, the CPU, the memory, the interactions. But I also care a lot about what the app is doing and what the user is doing. Because as part of the feedback for the planning, what paths are the users taking? What features are they leveraging? What features do we invest in? Where are the pain points? Where do users give up as part of the process? I need to know those things. So if I was in Azure Monitor, that gives me kind of the environment things, even some of the app to a certain degree. But then the details of what's happening within the app and how the user is working, that's things like Azure App Insights. That can have extensions in the client app to actually gather and show me the paths that the users are taking, where they give up as part of that journey. So we have to be able to gather those things to get that. And then I just think about, well, dashboards, reporting. I need to see it again. What are my key performance indicators? How are things actually performing and tracking? So we have to be able to relate to all of those different things. So Azure DevOps has the concept of dashboards. So if we jump over and look, hey, if I go to my Azure DevOps, and I'll actually just switch over again, I think, not because there's particularly anything interesting. If I go and look at my video planning, we have the summary. We have a summary. I have a dashboard. Now, I can add widgets to this dashboard. So notice it's things like assigned to me, build history, burn down, burn up. All of these things that actually are very powerful when I'm trying to understand how are things moving actually through what's happening in my environment. So if I looked, for example, at, let's say, cycle time, that could be very interesting. Okay, 3 days on average. So that's interesting. I can see the user stories. I can see how those things are moving through the environment. I could chart for my work items. Let's put that over here. Now I have to configure the widget. So I give it the details of actually what I'm trying to track, etc. Again, I'm not going into details on all these right now. I can see my build history. What's my burn down? Okay, I can kind of track my completed, scope increase. This is really all about measuring how am I performing as a team for my process. And there's a whole bunch of things. You can actually go and look at these. Sprint burn downs, sprint capacity, sprint overviews, team members, test results. All of those things I want to know about, I can see those in here. My work limits, I can go and track those. I'll say, hey, done editing. And again, I need to go and configure that. I don't really like that one there. But I'm actually going to delete that one out. But I can quickly go and see how am I performing actually as an organization. So this is a super powerful set of dashboarding I have in here. On the GitHub side, what I can do is we have insights. So once again, I have this idea of kind of a pulse, kind of an overview of where we are, what's happening, hey, number of commits. I can see actually commits that are happening. I can see code frequency. I can see dependency graphs. Dependency graphs, I don't have any manifests here, but they're super powerful when I start trying to work out again, okay, well, what are the dependencies I have in my project? What am I leveraging? Maybe things I want to move around. I can see all of that. I can see traffic. So I have a lot of good data available through these insights. Now I may also use things like Grafana is very popular to actually go and visualize exactly what's happening in my environment. But the key point is, as part of that feedback, I want to get that information. So those dashboards, and again, Azure DevOps is very, very rich, as you saw, gives me fantastic native information about this process. I can actually see everything that's going on. So what does all this mean? Again, I covered it pretty quick. There's just in the Microsoft space, there's multiple solutions. If you're well established, you're probably using Azure DevOps. You can absolutely just carry on using Azure DevOps. There's no reason not to, if it does everything you need. Now, chances are, if you're like a Visual Studio Enterprise or Professional, you can actually use GitHub. I think maybe there's a tiny fee involved, but it's tiny. And you can go and get basically GitHub Enterprise. So for those private repos, you can go and actually start leveraging it really with very minimal additional cost to your organization. In terms of long term, obviously, I don't think there's a secret. A lot of the Azure DevOps projects, they're kind of merged with the GitHub. A lot of the big, large-scale future investment, big initiatives, I think that is GitHub. But Azure DevOps still has investment in it. There are still changes being made to it. It's still supported and it's going to be planned for a really long time. You can go and look at the roadmaps. So here, this is the kind of the GitHub roadmap. They make this available. You can see all of the things they have planned. You can see the timelines they have planned. Huge amounts of investment for GitHub. You can kind of see all of the things they're doing. But Azure DevOps still has a features timeline as well. You can see there's features under development. They are still working on Azure DevOps. See future. So there is still work being done. It's just for like those really big, large scale massive changes, yes, that's GitHub. But again, I showed that kind of team foundation version control still in Azure DevOps. Azure DevOps is going to be around for a really long time, if not forever. So there's no kind of big rush. Now, we talked about today, Azure DevOps does some things better than GitHub, particularly around kind of this planning area and some of this continual kind of deployment, continual delivery. That will narrow very quickly. I do not expect to see that gap for much longer. I think GitHub will hit parity with everything DevOps can do and then surpass it. If I was starting off from scratch today, my focus would be GitHub. Can I just use GitHub? That's where I would be. If there were some weaknesses today, maybe I might use Azure DevOps for maybe some of the planning, if I can't make GitHub do what I want it to do. If I already have a huge investment in Azure DevOps, great, carry on using it. I would say if I can, I would probably try to move the repo to GitHub. Just because if you look at some of these security features it has, that's just huge benefit. That secret finding, the vulnerabilities, the code QL, that for me as a company is huge. Git is generally fairly easy to move. Now, I'm tying into the repo, maybe with my pipelines. But again, if I'm using Azure DevOps pipelines, releases integrate very easily to GitHub repos. It's a very simple change. So I'd probably move, if I can, to the repos just to get that additional functionality. Remember, there is that tight integration between them. But once again, use what is working for you. Like you may have a huge investment in the planning of Azure DevOps. Fantastic. Carry on using that. But I can still integrate that with the commits, the pull requests in GitHub. These things can all interact very, very tightly. But if I am starting today, I would definitely be focused on GitHub. I would try and do everything I could to just be in GitHub, just realistically. If I'm Azure DevOps today, again, I would definitely start with looking at repos. Is there a way I can start leveraging that to get that value to help me doing what I'm doing? But there is no right or wrong answer. It's about your process. It's about people being consistent within this. Hopefully this kind of showed how the parts fit together. Play around. Like the boards, again, these are free. I can just start playing with this. Create a Kanban board for your life. Things you want to get done. Organize maybe the things you're trying to get done just to learn. Create tasks. Again, tasks, yes, GitHub doesn't have those native hierarchy, but I can link the things. I can use that markup language to create the tasks. VS Code is free. Play around with these extensions. Repos, if they're public, I can really do what I want. I can do all of these things if it's a public repo for free as well. Even private, I get a bunch of free kind of build minutes across these. So I can really practice and do a lot of this stuff at zero cost. Once you start getting into private and teams, then at a certain level, you start paying for stuff. Especially kind of on the private GitHub repos for the secrets and those types of things, I have to license that, GitHub Enterprise. I think I did mention, I've talked about the cloud services, both Azure DevOps and GitHub have an on-premises version as well. But hopefully that helped. We've talked about the Azure DevOps and kind of the features, the cycle. This is now starting to assign some tools and to actually make that reality. As always, a lot of work goes into these. A like and subscribe really is appreciated. And until next time, take care.